In the 1830s, I observed a profound paradox in American democracy that continues to unfold before our eyes today. While Americans spoke passionately of liberty and individual rights, I detected beneath this rhetoric a deeper current, an almost irresistible drift toward what I termed soft despotism. The very equality that Americans cherished would, I predicted, eventually lead them to surrender their most precious freedoms in exchange for security, comfort, and the illusion of protection from life's uncertainties. This was not a failing unique to America, but rather the natural trajectory of all democratic societies where the passion for equality overwhelms the vigilance required to preserve liberty. Today, as Americans increasingly accept surveillance, regulation, and government dependency in the name of safety, my observations from nearly 2 centuries ago reveal themselves as prophecy rather than mere political theory. Chapter 1: The Democratic Seduction of Equality. During my journey through America, I witnessed firsthand how the democratic revolution transforms not merely political institutions, but the very soul of a people. Americans, born into equality, possessed no aristocratic memories to anchor their understanding of freedom. They knew liberty only as the absence of traditional hierarchies, not as the positive capacity for self-governance that requires constant vigilance and sacrifice. I observed that democratic peoples naturally gravitate toward equality over liberty because equality is immediately satisfying while freedom demands perpetual effort. When citizens compare themselves to their neighbors, they desire above all else that no one possess advantages they themselves lack. This passion for equality becomes so overwhelming that men would rather be equal in slavery than unequal in freedom. In aristocratic societies, liberty emerges from the tension between competing powers. Nobility, clergy, merchants, and crown all limit each other's authority. But in democratic America, I saw the gradual erosion of these intermediate institutions. Local associations, state governments, and civil society organizations that once mediated between individual and central authority were slowly yielding ground to federal power. The American character, shaped by commercial enterprise and practical success, valued results over principles. I noticed how citizens increasingly measured government effectiveness by its ability to solve problems and provide services, rather than by its respect for constitutional limits. This utilitarian approach to politics contained the seeds of democratic despotism. Citizens would eventually welcome any authority that promised to manage their affairs efficiently. Most troubling was the emergence of what I called individualism, not the healthy independence of democratic citizens, but a withdrawal from public life into private concerns. As Americans focused on personal prosperity and family welfare, they lost sight of the broader civic responsibilities that democracy requires. This civic disengagement would prove fatal to liberty, as tyranny advances most easily when citizens are absorbed in private affairs and indifferent to public power. Chapter 2: The Tyranny of Democratic Opinion. The most subtle danger I identified in American democracy was not the oppression of traditional despots, but the irresistible pressure of majority opinion. In aristocratic societies, individuals could find refuge in their class, profession, or region when opposing dominant views. But democratic equality eliminates these refuges, leaving the individual utterly exposed to social conformity. I witnessed how Americans, despite their proclaimed love of independence, exhibited remarkable uniformity in thought and behavior. The majority possessed not just political power, but moral authority so complete that questioning prevailing opinions required extraordinary courage. This tyranny of the majority operated not through physical coercion, but through social ostracism and economic pressure that could destroy anyone who dared dissent. The American press, which should have served as a check on this conformity, instead amplified majoritarian thinking. Newspapers catered to popular prejudices rather than challenging them, creating echo chambers that reinforced existing beliefs. I predicted that future communications technologies would intensify this phenomenon, making independent thought even more difficult to maintain. Religious conformity provided another example of democratic tyranny. While Americans enjoyed formal religious freedom, social pressure toward Protestant respectability was nearly irresistible. Catholics, Jews, and freethinkers faced subtle but effective exclusion from full participation in American life. This pattern would repeat itself with any group that challenged prevailing moral or political orthodoxies. Most concerning was how Americans internalized this conformity, believing themselves free while accepting unprecedented uniformity. They mistook the absence of legal restrictions for genuine liberty, not recognizing that social tyranny could be more oppressive than political despotism. A government that outlaws certain opinions must enforce its prohibitions through visible coercion, but a society that makes heterodox views socially impossible achieves the same result through invisible but irresistible pressure. This democratic conformity would eventually extend beyond opinion to behavior itself. Citizens would gradually accept government surveillance and regulation as necessary for maintaining social order, not recognizing that their voluntary submission to majority opinion had prepared them for involuntary submission to administrative authority. Chapter 3: The Decline of Civic Participation. Throughout my travels, I marveled at the extraordinary vitality of American associational life. In every town and village, citizens formed voluntary organizations to address common concerns, building schools, improving roads, supporting the poor, promoting moral reform. These associations served as practical schools of democracy, teaching citizens the skills of cooperation, compromise, and collective action essential for self-governance. Yet even then, I detected troubling signs of decline in this civic spirit. As government assumed greater responsibility for social welfare and public improvement, citizens became less inclined to organize voluntary efforts. Why struggle to build a school when the state could do it more efficiently? Why form a mutual aid society when government programs provided superior benefits? This transfer of responsibility from civil society to government represented more than mere administrative efficiency. It fundamentally altered the relationship between citizen and state. Active participation in voluntary associations developed civic virtues. Citizens learned to sublimate private interests for public good, to engage with diverse viewpoints, and to take personal responsibility for community welfare. When government assumed these functions, citizens became passive recipients of services rather than active agents of democracy. I observed how American restlessness and mobility undermined long-term civic commitments. Citizens moved frequently in pursuit of economic opportunities, weakening their ties to particular communities. This geographic mobility, while economically beneficial, made sustained civic engagement more difficult and reduced citizens' knowledge of local conditions and personalities essential for effective self-governance. The commercial spirit that drove American prosperity also threatened civic participation. As citizens focused increasingly on private wealth accumulation, they had less time and energy for public affairs. The marketplace taught valuable lessons about voluntary cooperation, but it also encouraged individuals to view politics through the lens of personal advantage rather than public good. Most significantly, I recognized that democratic equality itself discouraged civic leadership. In aristocratic societies, noble birth obligated individuals to public service regardless of personal inclination. But democratic equality provided no such external compulsion. Civic participation became entirely voluntary, dependent on individual motivation that could easily flag when private concerns pressed. Chapter 4: The Atomization of Democratic Society. The democratic revolution that swept away aristocratic distinctions accomplished something unprecedented in human history. It isolated each individual from his fellows, leaving him alone to face the overwhelming power of the whole society. This atomization, which I termed individualism, represented perhaps the gravest threat to democratic freedom. In aristocratic societies, Individuals belonged to permanent networks of obligation and dependence. A nobleman owed duties to his king and vassals, a craftsman belonged to his guild, a peasant was bound to his lord and village. These relationships, however unequal, provided security, identity, and protection against arbitrary power. Each person knew his place and could count on others within his social sphere for support and defense. Democracy promised to liberate individuals from these involuntary bonds, and in this it succeeded magnificently. Americans enjoyed unprecedented freedom to choose their occupation, residence, associations, and beliefs. Yet this liberation came at a hidden cost. It severed the social connections that had traditionally provided both meaning and protection. I observed how democratic equality encouraged Americans to believe they owed nothing to anyone and expected nothing from anyone except what they could earn through their own efforts. This self-reliance, admirable in many respects, bred a dangerous illusion of independence. Citizens forgot that human beings are inherently social creatures who depend on cooperation for both material prosperity and spiritual fulfillment. The market economy, while generating unprecedented wealth, reinforced this atomization. Commercial relationships, based on voluntary exchange between strangers, gradually replaced the permanent personal bonds that had characterized traditional society. Americans related to each other primarily as buyers and sellers, competitors and consumers, rather than as fellow citizens sharing common destiny. This social fragmentation left individuals psychologically vulnerable to what I called the gentle tyranny of administrative despotism. Isolated citizens, lacking intermediate institutions to organize resistance, would prove incapable of defending liberty against a paternal government that promised to manage their affairs and solve their problems. The very equality that freed them from aristocratic dependence would eventually make them dependent on centralized authority. Chapter 5: Religion as Democracy's Moral Foundation. During my American journey, I was struck by a paradox that contradicted European expectations. The most religious nation in Christendom was also the most democratic. While European intellectuals viewed religion and democracy as incompatible, religion supposedly requiring hierarchy and submission, democracy demanding equality and freedom, Americans demonstrated that faith could actually strengthen democratic institutions. Religion provided what democracy desperately needed but could not supply for itself: moral authority independent of popular will. Democratic governments derive their legitimacy from majority consent, but this creates a logical problem. If the majority is the ultimate source of right and wrong, then moral principles become mere matters of opinion, subject to revision whenever public sentiment shifts. American religion solved this dilemma by anchoring moral law in divine authority that transcended human preference. When Americans proclaimed that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, they placed fundamental principles beyond democratic debate. No majority, however large, could legitimately violate rights granted by God rather than government. I observed how religion encouraged the civic virtues essential for democratic self-governance. Religious communities taught cooperation, mutual aid, and subordination of private interest to common good. Church members learned to govern themselves through voluntary association, providing practical training for political participation. Religious moral education cultivated the self-restraint that democratic freedom requires. Citizens who could govern their own passions were better equipped to govern their society. Yet I also recognized religion's vulnerability in democratic society. The principle of equality that Americans applied to politics gradually extended to religious matters, encouraging denominational competition and doctrinal relativism. As citizens became accustomed to choosing their government, they also expected to choose their beliefs, treating religious truth as a matter of personal preference rather than objective reality. This democratization of religion would eventually undermine its capacity to provide moral authority independent of popular will. When religious teachings became subject to majority vote within congregations, and when competing denominations offered alternative interpretations of divine law, religion lost its ability to constrain democratic excess. Citizens would increasingly view moral principles as human constructions rather than divine commands, preparing the way for unlimited government power. Chapter 6: The Administrative Revolution. Perhaps my most prescient observation concerned the subtle transformation of government from a political institution into an administrative apparatus. While Americans celebrated their democratic freedoms and constitutional protections, I detected the emergence of a new form of authority that would eventually prove more comprehensive than any traditional despotism. Democratic governments, responding to citizen demands for services and solutions, gradually expanded their scope beyond the classical functions of defense, justice, and public order. I witnessed the early stages of this process as American authorities assumed responsibility for education, internal improvements, economic regulation, and social welfare, functions previously managed by families, churches, local communities, and voluntary associations. This administrative expansion proceeded through seemingly benevolent motives. Citizens wanted better schools, safer transportation, protection from economic exploitation, and assistance for the unfortunate. Democratic governments, deriving their authority from popular consent, naturally sought to satisfy these demands. Each new program appeared reasonable in isolation, but their cumulative effect was revolutionary. The new administrative state differed fundamentally from traditional tyranny. Classical despots ruled through fear, demanding submission but leaving most aspects of daily life alone. Administrative authority operated through services, regulations, and benefits that gradually penetrated every aspect of human existence. Citizens welcomed this intervention because it promised to solve their problems and improve their lives. I predicted that this gentle tyranny would prove more complete than any previous form of oppression. Traditional tyrants faced practical limits on their power. They lacked the technology, personnel, and information necessary to control their subjects' daily activities. But modern administrative states would eventually possess unprecedented capacity for surveillance, regulation, and social management. Most critically, administrative authority would erode the civic capacities essential for democratic self-governance. As government assumed responsibility for an ever-expanding range of human concerns, citizens would lose the skills, habits, and institutions necessary for independent action. They would become what I termed a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which government is the shepherd, prosperous, secure, and utterly dependent. The genius of this system was that citizens would choose their own subjugation, trading freedom for safety through democratic processes they mistook for liberty itself. Chapter 7: The Contemporary Fulfillment of Democratic Prophecy. Nearly 2 centuries after my observations, American democracy has evolved precisely as I anticipated. The gentle tyranny I predicted has emerged not through violent revolution or foreign conquest, but through the democratic process itself, as citizens have repeatedly chosen safety over freedom, convenience over responsibility, and administrative efficiency over self-governance. Consider how Americans today accept surveillance technologies that would have horrified previous generations. They carry devices that track their location, monitor their communications, and record their preferences, all in exchange for convenience and security. Government agencies collect vast databases of personal information, justified by the need to prevent terrorism, fraud, and other threats. Citizens protest these intrusions only weakly, because they value the protection and services this surveillance enables. The administrative state I glimpsed in embryonic form has reached full maturity. Federal agencies regulate everything from the food Americans eat to the words they speak, the businesses they operate to the associations they form. Citizens navigate a labyrinth of permits, licenses, regulations, and compliance requirements that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Yet they accept this comprehensive regulation because it promises safety, fairness, and expert management of complex social problems. Most telling is how Americans have internalized their dependence on centralized authority. They look to government for solutions to every social problem, from economic inequality to climate change to interpersonal conflict. The voluntary associations that once mediated between individual and state have withered, replaced by government programs administered by professional bureaucrats. Citizens relate to their government primarily as clients seeking services rather than as self-governing participants in democratic institutions. The majority tyranny I identified has been amplified by modern communications technology. Social media platforms create echo chambers that reinforce conformity while marginalizing dissenting voices. Citizens police each other's opinions through public shaming campaigns that can destroy careers and reputations instantly. This social control operates more effectively than government censorship because it appears voluntary and democratic. Yet Americans continue to believe themselves free because they retain the formal mechanisms of democratic choice. They can vote for different leaders and express diverse opinions within acceptable bounds. They mistake this limited political participation for genuine self-governance, not recognizing that substantive power has shifted from democratic institutions to administrative bureaucracies that operate largely beyond electoral control. Conclusion. The America I studied in the 1830s contained both the seeds of democratic greatness and the mechanisms of its own potential undoing. Today's Americans face the choice I saw embedded in their national character nearly 2 centuries ago. Will they reclaim the arduous responsibilities of self-governance, or will they complete their voluntary submission to the gentle tyranny of administrative benevolence? The answer will determine not merely America's future, but the fate of democratic civilization itself. For if the freest people in human history cannot preserve their liberty against the seductive promises of security and equality, what hope remains for democracy anywhere? The time for choosing has arrived, and delay itself represents a choice, the choice of comfortable servitude over the eternal vigilance that freedom demands.